This is a 1990 Ford Fiesta bonus, and it's one of the basic versions of Ford's third generation Fiesta, the most successful Supermini of the early 90s. Today I'm going to talk about the history, development and engineering behind what was until very recently a very normal little car, but is now an icon of its era. The Mk3 Fiesta went on sale in February 1989, and it was the first clean sheet Fiesta since the original back in 1976. But the Supermini game had moved on a lot over the last few years, with challenges such as the Peugeot 205, Citroën AX, Renault 5, Fiat Uno, Vauxhall Nova, Nissan Micra and Volkswagen Polo all moving the game on. So it was vitally important that this new Fiesta was not only the best Ford could do, but it also had to be popular. And you could argue that they succeeded. The Fiesta remained the most popular Supermini up until the Mk4 Fiesta replaced it in 1995. Ford needed to improve the composure and ability of the Fiesta, as cars like the Metro and most importantly the Peugeot 205 blew the old Fiesta completely out of the water. At the back there's a torsion beam, a good improvement from the old solid axle in the Mark II, and this is a standard recipe for a good handling hatch of this age. This means a Mark III is much happier while cornering hard or on uneven roads. At the front are McPherson struts, and braking is pretty standard as well, with discs at the front and drums at the back, but a first for the Fiesta is the option of anti-lock brakes, something that was very desirable back in 1989. Under the bonnet is pretty much the same engine seen in the Mark II Fiesta. This is a 1 litre 4-cylinder HES unit, which, to you and me, is either a Kent or a Valencia engine. For me, this is the most disappointing part of the car, as although it was still one of the most economical Superminis, it was down on power compared to its rivals, especially after 1990, when Rover put their K-Series into the Metro. It was always a decent enough engine, but this 1950s design was starting to show its age a little bit. Ford had been continuously updating it here and there to keep it somewhat competitive, with a new cylinder head for these HES engines. Here, it makes 44 brake horsepower. A carburettor is still the order of the day, as it was in every Supermini of the era, and interestingly, Ford uses fully electronic ignition control, which means there's no distributor. But there's still a manual choke. Let's take a look at the styling, and to be honest, I can't quite make my mind up. While it's certainly more modern than the Mark II, I can't help but feel it doesn't quite look as good. It straddles the two eras of boxy and curvy. I think it looks better than the equivalent 205, but a bit fussier than the Metro. By the time Nissan introduced the K11 Micra and Vauxhall launched the Corsa B, this Fiesta looked a little boxy in an increasingly curvy world. There's no denying that the Mark IV Fiesta cured this, but it had a sad face. But then again, if I take away all external influences, I really like the way these cars look. The front end is clean and uncluttered, but the rear end is my favourite bit. I love the integration of the lights into the lines of the boot lid and the sides. But to me, the sides are a little bit undefined, without a distinct shape to speak of. Once you get inside though, you really start to be impressed. Because the dashboard is really very nice. It feels like it's from a car in the class above, to be honest. And that's reflected also in the driving position, which is very, very good. Especially compared to most of the Superminis of the era. The steering wheel is pretty much right in front of you, as are the pedals. And the stalks, which are quite sturdy really, they feel cheap but sturdy, if you know what I mean. And they have the horn on the end, and obviously left indicator and right indicator, and then your lights when you click around like that, and of course your flash and your main beam. On the top you have standard Ford parts bin clicker for your hazards, which makes a relatively nice noise. And over on the right you have your wipers, so there is a mist function there, and then first speed and second speed, and then you wash if you press at the end. In this one you don't get a rev counter, just a speedometer, fuel gauge and temperature gauge, all very basic, but it works. And you get an array of warning lights down here. And down here you have an odometer which doesn't have the extra digits, so as far as I know, this car's done 643,000 miles. One of the most excellent things about the car is storage, because you have, of course, a little tea shelf up here, which isn't exactly flat, so isn't great for tea. But you do have this little cubby here. You have another little cubby here where a clock would be on a higher end model. A big cubby here where the glove box would be again on a higher model. You have decent sized door bins, and even another little cubby down here, which is where your fuse box is at the back. Everything is very logical. You have your ventilation controls here, of course. You have your fan speed and your sliders for temperature and direction. These don't feel necessarily the best quality. They all feel a little bit weak, and these feel a little bit stodgy, but it's an economy car, we'll forgive them for that. And then you have two buttons down here for your heated rear window and your rear fog lights. Again, these are momentary switches, but they just don't quite feel like they don't have a feel of quality to them. And below that you have a radio, which is not very visible to you when you're driving, so changing radio stations does involve looking quite far down. But this of course is a Sony one, which is aftermarket. And then finally below that you have your cigarette lighter, obligatory for the era of the car, and then an ashtray, which is quite big, really quite big. No cassette storage rack or anything like that down at the bottom, because of course this is pretty much base model. The gear shift now, only 4 speeds on this one, and for reverse, which is over here, you push down and go all the way across reverse. But the gear change itself just feels a little bit stodgy, a little bit weak, a little bit disconnected maybe. And it's a similar story with the pedals. This clutch pedal doesn't particularly feel connected to anything, although the brake and throttle feel a little bit better. The throttle has a very short travel to it. The pedals are in front of you, which is good for a Supermini this age, but there is no rest for your clutch foot. And also, if you are wearing boots like I am, you take your foot off the clutch and it smacks against the heater box. So that's not the best bit of design there, but it's not bad for the class. These door cards have a ridiculously 90s pattern to them. Of course, you have your door handle and your manual window winder, that big door pocket I talked about before, and a speaker down there, as well as your door pull and a little armrest here. But what does surprise me is this is pretty much base model. It is base model, but it's the bonus, so it's a special edition. I'm not exactly sure what the bonus got you, but this has interior adjustable mirrors, which I don't have on my base model Metro. So maybe that's a tick for Fiesta there. Unlike most Superminis of the time, the material on the door comes all the way to the top, so there's no exposed metal on the top of the doors, which again is unusual for this age. Again, not sure whether that's a bonus thing or all base model Fiestas had it like this, but that's good nonetheless. What's a little bit more disappointing though is the seats, and they're quite soft and they're relatively comfortable, but there isn't much support to them. So as much as it feels quite comfortable, I can already feel there's not much shoulder support there, and there's certainly no bolstering at the side, so if you corner harshly, you're just going to fall straight off your seat. But again, headroom is good, leg room is good, even if the clutch pedal is a little bit off, it's a nice place to be. The best thing about the entire interior is headrests. Look at them. It's a base model car with actual fabric headrests in 1990. How amazing is that? Wonderful. It's the little things, isn't it? It's always the little things. Little thing of interest is that there are these ribs in the headliner. I've no idea why, but it is a little bit cheap, to say the least. And now I'm sat in the back, and it's quite comfy back here. Of course, there are no headrests on a car of this age, but it's quite nice nonetheless. You do get, because it's 1990, you need 3-point seat belts on at least 2 seats, and there's a lap belt in the middle. But I have a decent amount of legroom here. I mean, I know I am up against the seat, but it's scalloped in a little bit at the back and my feet slide underneath. So I'm perfectly comfortable back here, which is not something you can say about every Supermini from this era. This is certainly one of the more practical Superminis, and that was the conclusion that all the journalists that reviewed this car back in the day also came to. As it's a base model, you don't get any pop-out rear windows, but you do get these little rear quarter cards, which are not scratchy. They feel quite well deadened. But of course, in the side here there is a little pop-out ashtray, as is usual for cars of this era. My Metro has the same kind of thing. It's just something you wouldn't quite see on a car today, but even on Superminis of this era, that was still a standard part. I find it slightly curious that in the promo videos for the Mark III, Ford made a massive thing about the split folding rear seat, something that you'd already been able to get in a lot of other Superminis for a number of years. But you should go and watch that marketing video, because the acting is absolutely horrendous, and there's a horrible rip-off of Van Halen's Jump. It's the most late 80s cheesy thing you'll ever be able to see related to cars. There is one thing about the interior that really did surprise me though, and not in a good way. I'm told that this is as it was meant to be from the factory, but I still doubt that because I can't believe that a car launched in 1989 doesn't have self-cancelling indicators from the factory. At least not on the base model. The mechanism is in there, but it doesn't click the indicators off, and I'm told by the owner that that is how this spec of Fiesta was back in the day. I am absolutely shocked that a car of this age has no self-cancelling indicators. The entire package feels very grown up compared to the Mark II, and I think we can mark this as one of the cars that brings the Supermini into a new age of refinement. Not in terms of engineering refinement, as it was still outclassed in that department, but in terms of interior refinement and feel and design. It's such a big step up from the Mark II in those respects. But that might be unsurprising, as the Mark III is a much larger car than the Mark II was. Now, although the Fiesta was a good car and quite clearly the most successful, the motoring magazines seem to be generally disappointed with the Mark III when compared to its peers. In May 1990, Autocar said the HES engine sounded like a sewing machine with worn bearings, and that the car lacks composure, with the steering feeling heavy, low-geared and lifeless. Honest John calls it stodgy and uncultured. Even the new rear suspension gets criticism. It apparently squirms over bumps in a way the Peugeot 205 doesn't. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who disagree with all of that in the comments, but I've yet to see a review of a cooking model Fiesta that gushes over it in the way so many do with the 205 or Metro in terms of dynamics. The Mark III Fiesta wasn't a revolution or anything particularly special or different, but it was a massively popular car that improved on its predecessors and secured the lion's share of the 90s Supermini market for Ford. The RS Turbos may be the teenager's wet dream that commands some decent money these days, but the humble cooking models are the ones that were on every street corner when I was a kid. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed, please click like and subscribe, and I'll be along with another one next week.